Hello and welcome to the Blindseyepodcast, the podcast discussing everything you did and didn't want to know about being blind. My name is Connor, and this week we are going to be talking about guide dogs and why they are not machines like some people seem. So I thought that would be interesting to go into because there is a little bit of a tendency, even by myself when I first got mine, to think they're really well-trained dogs, therefore mistakes can't happen or shouldn't happen, or are a bad sign if they do happen. So I thought it would be interesting to unpack that, and everybody likes dogs, so why not have another episode about it? Usual disclaimer, thoughts and opinions, keep it in mind. Okay, so when it comes to guide dogs, as I said, there is a tendency for people to think, hey, these are really well-trained, expensive dogs, they've been raised a certain way their entire life, therefore they must be perfect, or something is going on, or they think that accidents can't happen or shouldn't happen, and that's not really the case. I mean, I guess I even had some of those opinions to a certain extent when I got mine. I'm still on my first. I've only had her for just on 2 years now, but I definitely thought that, and I guess what it really comes down to is they're an animal. We are an animal, they are an animal, and as well trained as they are, they still have thoughts and emotions and distractions just like we do. So while just like we usually do the right thing or usually try and do something in a certain way, we all have our moments where something gets in the way or something doesn't quite happen the way we would like it to. And it's the exact same case with the dog, but I guess people tend to think, well, they shouldn't really be doing that. They should just be almost like a little slave, and that should be that. And because sometimes I get it where somebody says, oh, she's not really behaving right, or maybe, oh, you think she'd be, trained better than that. But it's just kind of shows that there's a lot more going on. So there's 3 or 4 big things I would define as being central to how your guide dog works, and basically how you work as a partner with your guide dog, because there is a tendency for people to think, I just grab hold and she does the rest, but it really is a team. It's a partnership. It took about a year for us to click, and some days we still have our moments where we don't click. So for me, I would say it comes down to a couple of things. It comes down to rhythm, it comes down to reinforcement and routine, and it comes down to trust. So when I say rhythm, basically what that means is that what's happening on a certain day tends to happen for the rest of the day. Sometimes you get up and, you're in a good mood yourself and everything just clicks. And because it clicks, it means everything else clicks and you're in a better mood for it. You're less anxious about it. And it works the exact same way when you're out with your dog. Sometimes you'll start up and within a few feet or a few meters, you'll have something that kind of goes a bit wrong, and you might have a bit of an off day, or the dog might have a bit of an off day. And that just might set the tone for, the entire experience. And one thing after another kind of builds up, and you find your rhythm is really out of sync. On other days, you'll find that everything's just smooth and you don't even particularly know why, but everything's just clicking. And because it's clicking, you're feeling good, the dog is feeling good. And because you're both feeling good, everything else tends to work. I'll come back to the whole idea of confidence and trust in just a little bit, but the second big thing is routine or reinforcement. So the more you do things, the more often you do things, the more often you do the right things and pick up on the wrong things, the better chance you have of having a good experience. So currently, I'm in a position where, because of COVID, we haven't been out all that much. I haven't been going into work. So the times when we're both getting to walk around are either limited or in very specific settings. So, for example, because we aren't really out and about too much, we haven't been going to train stations or into like business areas or really populated, busy areas like the way I would when I was going to work. So while her abilities in suburban kind of areas have been fairly good, they still have fallen off a little bit. Her ability to be able to dodge massive amounts of people in the same way aren't as sharp as what they were. And I'm also not as sharp as what I am because I haven't been in those situations, and it's a bit sort of anxiety producing. So if it causes a bit of that for her, it causes that a bit for me, or she can feel it through me, and that can really impact on how you're going. But in a situation where I'm mostly on suburban streets bringing her for a walk or walking to the shops, she's really doing quite well. Whereas before, when I was working, she wasn't really in a lot of those situations. So she was a little bit worse in those situations, and I was probably a little bit worse. Whereas now it's kind of flipped on its head because that reinforcement and that routine hasn't been there. We both haven't been exposed to some of those situations that we were exposed to, so the sharpness isn't quite there. As I said as well, it really comes down to trust, and that's why it takes about a year for the trust between yourself and your dog to really build and for you guys to click, because you have to understand how each other works. So it took her a while to understand what it is that I was maybe wanting from her, or for her to be able to read how I operate. And same for me. She doesn't speak human, I don't speak dog. So it takes a while to work out, okay, what's the story? Because in some situations, a person is happy to walk out the door and, you know, their anxiety levels aren't really too high naturally or by default. And in other situations, there are. And in some situations, the dogs are just naturally really confident and bouncy. And in others, they might get a little bit more panicked or stressed out. And that's not because they aren't worthy of being a guide dog. It's just because all living things have slightly different makeups, and there's lots of things that impact on that, either maybe their experiences or just their genetics or whatever it might be. So you have to take all these things into account when you're trying to get to know one another. But it's also important to know that while the trust builds and the confidence builds, you still have your moments where your confidence is shaky, whether it's because something might have happened or you're just having an off day. So I had quite a bad fall last year, and it wasn't even anything to do with my dog Lick. I'd actually had a few drinks on me. I was coming out of a pub, and the person who I was with and I were just kind of distracted, and I rolled my ankle off the gutter and fell into the road and really badly sprained my ankle. And what that meant was, for me, for months, and even now to a certain extent, I have this kind of baseline fear of, well, am I going to roll my ankle again and do that kind of damage or worse? Because I'm always on footpaths. Sometimes there's little ankle breaking kind of places off the side of footpaths. And as much as myself or the dog know that things are around, you can still have your accidents. So what it meant was, for a long time, I was walking in a very certain way, almost prepared to fall at any step, but it also meant I wasn't moving smoothly, and she could probably feel the tension or the anxiety within me, which then passed along to her. So in a situation like that, my own confidence in certain situations impacted how our rhythm and our routine sort of flowed. And then the trouble is that impacts on your reinforcement. So if you have a couple of days where there's a lot of stress or anxiety, then that kind of becomes the norm. And then what you can find is that the repetition is slightly out of rhythm, and it's all based on repetition. So then the more you do it, if you aren't correcting it, the more you find that what you're repeating is anxiety provoking. if that makes sense. A really other clear example of it would be this very second day I had her. It was my second day of training, and we were walking, and I fell over. And for me, that immediately went to, well, how can I walk around with any kind of confidence when I just stacked it? And I couldn't even remember the last time I fell over when I was using a cane, because obviously you're putting your trust in a living thing that can think and be distracted and stuff like that. So for a while, that really hindered my ability to be able to trust her. And the fact that it happened also probably shook her up a little bit as well, because she didn't like that it had happened. You know, she probably got yanked on a little bit as I fell, so it wasn't a pleasant experience for her. So as much as these things might stick in my mind, they stick in her mind as well. So it's about trying to problem solve. And that's why we have the guide dog instructors that we can call to come and help us out and maybe give us some tips. And it is good that we can call the instructors out, because basically a lot of times it comes down to, do you need to trust and go with the dog, or is the dog actually playing up a little bit? And I can't see to tell what's what. So in certain situations, we might be walking and she just decides to stop. And in half of those situations, she's decided to stop because there's something in the way that she can tell will impact on me or might be dangerous. But in some situations, she might stop because she just wants to smell the flowers. Or there's an ant on the ground that she can't get past because she doesn't like ants. So you end up finding yourself in a situation where you're kind of think, do I go with the dog or do I need to take over the situation? And that can be the really tricky part, because inevitably what happens is you have situations where you don't trust the dog when you should have, and you don't correct the dog when you should have. And it's trying to make sure you're getting that right more than wrong. But at the end of the day, when you can't see, there's always going to be situations. Like if there's an ant on the ground, I'm not going to be able to tell that. Even if I'm using a cane to find it out. Like sometimes I have a little cane on me just to feel around if she stops. But I'm not going to know that it's an ant that's bothering her. So in that situation, I just think she's being bad or she's not doing the right thing. So all of these kinds of things add up. And then because they add up, they then impact on what will happen next time, or your response to what happens impacts on what happens next time. Because everybody has their day. Like some people don't like to admit it, but everybody has their day where you're on a bit of a shorter fuse and you just think the dog's playing up and whatever. And then you react. I'm not saying badly. It's not like abusive or anything like that, but you react in a bit of a way that I guess they can probably tell you're annoyed. And that might be the difference between the dog going, oh, he's annoyed, I need to snap myself into gear, or he's annoyed and I'm going to sort of curl up because I feel bad that I did the wrong thing. And that's why you need to learn how your dog operates, because in certain situations, the dogs will excel and it's just part of their personality. And in others, you need to be more understanding of their makeup, because they might be a little bit more likely to shut down if they feel that they're doing the wrong things, just the way children would. It's actually a really good example. When I got her first, I was learning how to get to work, and at this particular station, I was getting off the station, and I was getting off the train at the station, and we got off the train, and I knew to get to the escalators, we were supposed to turn right. And I was telling her to find right, and she turned left. So in my mind, I went, no, we're not going left, we need to go right. So I corrected her, and she still wouldn't go right, even though I was telling her to, and I wasn't going with her. So then I kind of forced us to go right, and I hit a pylon because there was a pylon there. So all she could do to get me out of the way was to go left and give it a wide berth and then come back around to the right-hand side. But I didn't realize that was the case. So I took over the situation even though I should have gone with her. And then you have situations where it's vice versa, where she is doing the wrong thing and I do need to take over. So there is really no one size fits all, because you can't, just by the nature of the fact that you can't see, you can't always tell. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It's that other thing as well, that people tend to fall into the trap of thinking they can speak dog, and thinking that just because they've had their dog for a long time and you have a connection, that therefore you understand how the dog works. And in a lot of cases you do, but there's a tendency to think of the dog the way you would think of a human or a child, when they're not. They're a different animal. I had the cases where I was convinced that she must understand the logic I was using, because in so many situations she seems to. So as an example of that, I would go to the bottom of some stairs, and if she finds the stairs, she gets a treat every now and then to kind of reinforce it. But what was happening was I was starting to reach into the treat bag a few feet from the stairs. So she started stopping when my hand would go into the treat bag. And in my mind, I was thinking, come on, you know that I mean you're going to get this when you get to the stairs. But in her mind, she thought, I'll stop, you're putting your hand in the treat bag. So maybe that means this is where you want me to be, so I'll stop. And it took us a while to get out of that habit, because in her mind, she was probably thinking, this must be where you want me to be, because you're showing signs that you're going to reward me. Whereas in my mind, I was using the human logic of going, yeah, but come on, you know what I mean, we're nearby. And I was thinking, oh, well, how the dog should just know that I'm just preparing the treat for her. But that might not be the case, because I don't speak dog, she doesn't speak human. And on that, actually, I was just speaking with my instructor last week, because we've been having a few issues in an area we always go to. And she said this great line to me, that often what makes guide dogs perfect for being a guide dog is also the thing that can make them problematic in certain situations, because they are so good at repetition that it makes them beautiful in order for you to be able to use them as a guide dog. But what happens is, if the repetition is slightly off, they'll just remember that and keep repeating that. So as an example, in my local shopping center, sometimes if we're doing the shopping, we will be walking, and instead of walking from across a driveway from one pathway to another, we might cut through the car park with the trolley, because we can't get the trolley down onto the roadway depending on where we're parked in the actual car park. And we've done that so many times that now when I try and ask her to cross straight over to the other pathway, she doesn't, because as far as she's concerned, when we get here, we always veer in another direction. So the very thing that makes it brilliant when it works in terms of repetition and in terms of them going, oh, this is where we always go, is one thing. But then if you change that up slightly, they can kind of think, well, this is the way we always go, so maybe this is what you mean. Even if I'm saying that I want to go straight, she might think, but hang on, when we're here, we always go here. It's the same if I go to my local coffee shop. She will always try and find the seat that I prefer to sit in, because 9 times out of 10, that's where we sit, even if there's somebody sitting there, because in her mind, that's where we always go. So that's where I must want her to go. And that's great. But then in situations where somebody might be sitting there and I'm asking her to find a seat or find another seat, she will insist on trying to find that seat, because that's what we always do. And that's where it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because that's what you love and admire about the dogs, that they can be like that. But what it also means is that when you're trying to change things up, or if things get a little bit out of sync, that can become problematic. So finally, on a side note to this, there's a lot of other factors that are involved in the kind of day or experience you'll have. So here in Australia, especially if it's hot, the ground can get so hot that it's actually painful for the dogs to be walking on concrete on the road because it burns their feet. So that will massively impact on the kind of experience you're having. So, like I said, as well trained as they are, they're not so well trained that they're okay with being burned. So you have to take all these things into account. As a rule, they teach you to, on a hot day, put the back of your hand on the ground. And if it's too hot for the back of your hand, then it's too hot, as a rule, for the dog to be out and about. So I tend to limit my activities once it gets that hot. Basically, for me, if she can't stand still without having to keep lifting her feet because the ground is uncomfortable for her, then it's easier for me to just stay inside or get a taxi and just take the pressure off her, because I don't want her to be uncomfortable and I don't want her to remember that bad experience. Same again, on a hot day, you might be coming to a crossing and sometimes there's electrical or water pipes that are underground, so there might be a bit of a metal grating, and those things boil in the heat, especially in Australia where it's like 40 degrees. So you might be waiting at the lights and you have to stand on that, or you have to stand back 10 feet because you can't stand on that because it's so painful for her. So again, it's an animal. It feels, it has different experiences, and as well trained as it is, that's just the reality of the situation. They do actually give you like little booties for them to wear, but most of the dogs don't really like wearing them. You know, it's kind of like a child when they're little. They don't want to wear clothes because it's not really natural. So it takes them a while to get used to the idea that they should wear them. But with my girl, at least, she absolutely hates the booties. If she even sees me coming near her with them, she'll run to the other end of the house because she just doesn't like them. And also, the other side of it is that dogs regulate their temperature through their paws, and they sweat through their paws. So by having the booties on, while it might mean that their feet aren't burning, it's also kind of getting in the way of the natural process, and it might stop them from being able to cool down naturally and interfere, with some of their, I guess, their internal regulation. I did already mention ants, so she absolutely hates ants. If we walk along a footpath and there's an ant's nest or there's a line of ants around, she'll either stack it or not stack it, she'll stop and will be very ginger, or she'll just leg it through and kind of drag me along because she's trying to get past as quickly as possible. And the same again with bindies in the grass around spring and summertime. She doesn't want to be walking on the grass because they're spiky and they can get into her paws and cause her pain. So again, yes, really well trained. 9 times out of 10, they know the deal, but they still feel, and they're still animals. Personally, I would say the biggest distraction I've found is either when it's windy or when it's raining or just after it's been raining, because obviously dogs are very reliant on their scent, and the wind picks up lots of different smells. So you often find that if you're walking on a day where it's windy or where it has been windy, that the dog is a little bit more off its game because it's just picking up on so many things, picking up on the pollen, the flowers, and it's like overload for them, and they just are trying to check everything out, and their distraction levels are really, really high. Same again when it's been raining, because as we all know, you get different kinds of smells that come to life after it's been raining, and the exact same process happens where the dog kind of goes, oh, what's this? What's this? And so you're walking along and they're trying to check everything out when you're just trying to walk straight and get to wherever you're going, because there's so much overload on their senses that they need to suss things out. And that's how they gather information about where they are and what's going on. So, those kinds of things all impact. So, look, I thought that would be an interesting thing to explore, especially as it's kind of happening with us at the moment. So, yeah, I hope that was interesting. As always, you can get in touch with the show by emailing blindseyepodcast@gmail.com. That's BLINDSEYE podcast@gmail.com. You can tweet the show at blindseyepod, and you can find me on Facebook if you search for Blindseye Podcast. And I will be back to speak to you next week. Cheers.